Happy New Year, family, and welcome to the Hope TV once again. We're bringing you season 6 with a whole lot of new content. And tonight, I know you won't be disappointed. For the very first time on the Hope TV network, we're premiering Theology in 30. Yes. So the vision for Theology in 30 was birthed in 2018. I talked with our executive producer, Dr. E. Dewey Smith Jr., and our creative team, and they said it was okay to bring Theology in 30 to our Hope TV platform. And I'm just really honored and excited. So you already know we're going to start strong. Tonight's Theology in 30 is about the intersections of hip hop and preaching. That's right. And when we think about the vision for Theology in 30, the vision for Theology in 30 is all about encouraging and engaging people to talk about theology and how it informs our approach to preaching and teaching and also ministry. So this is going to be an exciting episode. I have none other than the Reverend Moya Harris with us. I need y'all to show her some love in the comments. And before I introduce her, we want to grow our viewership for Theology in 30, and we need your help. Yes, I need our viewing audience, everybody who's tuned in right now. I need you to do two things. Yes. First, I need you to follow us on Instagram at The Hope TV, and also share our link from this page to your personal page. Can you do that for me? Thank you so much. We also want to take a moment to thank all of you who have been supporting Hope TV since its very beginning, since we started in March of 2020. We love y'all, and we thank you so much for your support. So now to this amazing guest we have with us on the first episode of Theology in 30 on Hope TV. She is none other than the Reverend Moya Harris. She's the executive minister at Metropolitan AME Church, where the Reverend Bill Lamar is the senior pastor. She's a gifted scholar and leader, and she is interested in the intersections of womanism, hip hop, homiletics, and rhetoric. She believes that Generation X, also known as the hip hop or post soul generation, has often been neglected or overlooked by the church. And so her scholarship aims to bridge that gap. Please join me in welcoming for the first time on the Hope TV, Reverend Moya Harris. Reverend Moya, say hello to everybody tonight.
Hello, everyone. It is such a blessing to be here today. I'm excited. I didn't know I was going to be on the first Theology in 30, so this is great. I'm excited.
Yes. Who else, though? Who else? Who else would I invite than the person that I theologize with? I'll let the audience know, because this is a great space for us to just talk and to dialogue. I'll let the audience know, listen, she is my sister friend and probably one of the most promising theological minds that I know. So y'all just welcome my sister. Let's jump right into it. You're welcome. Let's jump right into it. We're going to talk first about how you knew you were called to preach. So, you know how people think you knew all your life that you were called to preach, that we were born like that. We were at the hospital, and when we came out, mama said she's going to be a preacher or he's going to be a preacher. I don't think it works like that for everybody. So I want to ask you, you've been working in ministry in the AME church for several years. What experiences have confirmed or affirmed that you're called to preach?
Well, it's interesting because I did not grow up in the church. I accepted Christ as a young adult, and I've been a nurse for a long time. I was about to tell years. Y'all need to know. But so throughout my career, God has affirmed my call in so many different ways. Where I am now at Metropolitan, I've been allowed to be a scholar, to be authentic in my call, not to have to conform to a lot of the traditional ways that AME preachers are always expected to be. So in my authentic way of being and my love of hip hop, God has continued to just call me and push me in different directions. So even if you didn't grow up in the church, God is still calling. I was amazed.
I love this. I love this. So you've already introduced the content for tonight in your introduction of your call. This is so awesome. So I want to just segue from that into the question of when you think about your preaching ministry, how you live at these intersections of hip hop and womanism. And I also feel like there's a liberationist element to your preaching in addition to all of that. So my question is, what do you love most about your preaching? And let me stop here to say, we talk a lot about our homiletical theory and how we feel about preaching. Yeah, you know what I like the most? The
Mm-hmm.
fact that we can communicate the gospel, right, in ways that anyone can relate to. You talked about not growing up in church. So I said
Mm-hmm.
it earlier this week. Our preaching should place God in street clothes so that theology
Exactly.
is relatable for people, right? So, what do you love the most about your preaching style?
I think the fact that I finally am finding my voice. I've been for so long I was taught to conform to this way of preaching and that way of preaching, but I love the fact that I can bring in hip hop songs into my sermons. Like I had an Easter sermon where it was called Gardens and Ghettos, and I actually quoted the words to "The world is a ghetto," and just the fact that I can touch different generations and put little colloquialisms in there, but also still preach theology in a way that is liberating and freeing, and so that people can see themselves in in the sermons.
So, I had a conversation with one of our producers earlier today as I was preparing for our interview, and she was laughing at me because she was like, "You're interviewing someone who is steeped, who knows a lot about hip hop. Well, what do you know about hip hop?" And she started out asking me, "What about MC Light? What songs you know by MC Light?" And I was like, "I don't know any songs by MC Light." So then she was like, "What about Queen Latifah?" And I was like, "I don't really know any Queen Latifah." So she was like, "Do you even know hip hop?" And what we realized is that I was one of those people who really loved R&B. I was the
Mm,
R&B. And the only hip hop kind of, and she said this one doesn't even count, but the only hip hop artist I remember from growing up was Crisscross, right?
wow. Yeah, I don't count.
Right. She said that didn't count. So, as someone who really understands the hip hop musical genre, and you and I have talked, and you quote from a lot of different songs. Which hip hop artist would you say shows up the most in your sermons?
You know what's funny? I don't have a one person, and I do. I would say mostly I use R&B music. Really, I do go lean that way, but a lot of Nas. Um, I definitely I see like when I hear something, it goes to a lyric, so it might not even be a specific person, but it hits my ear, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like my Easter sermon was "Can't Keep Running Away" by the Far Side,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
yeah, so that was my sermon, and then but then like people in the Generation X um era they hear that, but if you don't hear it, you just keep on going. So I do kind of like I kind of put that in my sermons in ways to kind of draw people in who might have grown up like I did. But
So it's kind of like
yeah,
sampling, right?
yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
kind of
definitely
sampling.
stamping.
How
Yeah,
a lot of the songs we hear now, they're just sampling artists from back in the day. There would
they're
be
sampling the
times.
samplers now.
Yes, they're
Yeah.
sampling the samplers, right? So I really appreciate you sharing that.
That's a winner, yes.
The family's visit to the forest inspired a beautiful question. Mother, mother, am I a tree? You tell me to stand tall. You tell me to stay rooted. I think I am a tree. My child, of course you are. But what kind of tree will you be? The kind to hug or the kind to climb? Doesn't matter what you choose, so long as you choose to be a tree that's kind.
Make the forest part of your story at a park near you. Find one at discovertheforest.org.
I mean, y'all didn't know the answer to this, but John P. Key is your name, but what does the P stand for?
The P actually stands for Prince. Dr. Scott and Brian Scott, years ago when I signed my first deal, they ran with it and started the Prince of Gospel, but that's where it came from. Lizzie and John named me John Prince Key.
I want to move now into theology. You and I both are students of Dr. Frank Thomas, and he talks about moral imagination in his book, How to Preach Your Sermon. So his theology of preaching has to do with us practicing, number one, empathy, envisioning equality, incorporating sources of wisdom and the language of poetry. So I want to know from you, Reverend Moya, with you living at the intersections of womanism, hip hop, rhetoric, liberation theology, Black theology, all of this, what would you summarize in one sentence as your theology of preaching? Because I agree with Dr. Shibley T.J. Smith. As preachers, we need to know what our theology is. What are our views about God's action in the text, God's action in the world? So in one sentence, and I know that's hard, how would you describe your theology of preaching?
Right now, because we're still working on this, but right now I would say that my theology of preaching is that God, even in spite of all of the ontological anxiety that we're going through, God is still making things new. God is still.
Wait, stop. You know what you got to do for our viewers, for our
I got to unpack
theology.
the ontological.
Yes, you got to unpack that and define that. I know what you're talking about, and I almost jumped out of my chair when you said it. But tell our viewing audience, what is that?
Yeah.
What are our ontological experiences?
So ontology is way of knowing. It's your way of being, of how you show up in the world, and then the anxiety of the way that the world is. So there's scholars that argue that being Black, we live in a continuous state of ontological anxiety. We're always worried about our state of being, if we're under attack for even just being Black. And it could be physical anxiety. It could be the fact that we might go out and get shot by police, or by that kind of existence. And then I would say, as Black women, we have an ontological, and we have those layers of that anxiety of being Black and being a woman in the world. So the way that I see the world is through this lens of ontological anxiety. When I form my sermons, I'm looking at how the world is not what God intends. So that when I'm forming my sermons, that's how I would say, I always go in my mind, I'm thinking Public Enemy, Welcome to the Terror Dome. I've got so much trouble on my mind, refuse to lose. To me, I've got so much trouble is like that problem in the world, but I refuse to lose is the hope that God is making things new in the world. So I know that wasn't one sentence, but that's what I got.
No, powerful. So I want to focus in on a couple of things that you said, because what you just shared your homiletical theory, your method, clearly. So I know you say that you're working on it, but I think you got it. I think you got it. So I want to focus in on one thing that you said. You mentioned this whole concept of hope, right? So when we talk about preaching, and here, I got to jump on my own homiletical theory soapbox. I believe this, and this came out of Lisher. You remember Lisher?
Yes, I do.
Right. If preaching is not theological, I believe it's not preaching. If it doesn't point to God, it's not. You're just talking. You're sharing a speech. So I want to focus on this whole idea of hope, not because I know you, but I think that there may be a part of your homiletical method that you're exposing with this idea of hope. Like, should every sermon embody or lift some kind of hope in your estimations or in your methodology?
I think so. Because I do ascribe to the Frank Thomas celebration mode of preaching, but I believe
Yeah.
that there's space for lament. So even in the lament, there needs to be hope. That because our ancestors, they lived in this ontological anxiety of being enslaved, right? But they had this
Right.
hope when they sang the spirituals, when they were in church, and in the hush harbors. Hope is essential, and whether it's this worldly or otherworldly, I think it's both and.
So you tapped into something with me. You already know where I'm going. If you know me like I think you do, I'm into this whole Howard Thurman piece. When
Mm-hmm.
Nolan Hubbard quotes Howard Thurman and says the Black sermon is that event or that moment when we as a people were able to take shackles,
Mm-hmm.
psychological shackles, and turn them into weapons of defense. So I
Mm-hmm.
want to talk to you a little bit about this whole idea of how we channel the ontological anxiety. And I want to ask you, when we deal with texts that have formerly been used to oppress African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
how do you, as a homiletician, as a scholar, as a preacher, as a Black woman, how do you deal with difficult texts that have been used and misappropriated and misused and really abused and used to abuse others? How do you approach those difficult texts as a homiletician?
So it's interesting. I never really figured out how I really did it, but I was in conversation with our classmate, Larry Morris.
Yeah.
And what he calls queering the text, because he deals with queer theology, but just what he does is look at the power dynamics in the text and see
Yes.
where the least amount of power is and look at the text from that perspective. Whose voice is not heard? Whose name is not listed? Who has the most to stand to lose in the text, and look at it from that perspective. That just opened my eyes. I was like, that's dope, because that's liberation theology, basically. You look at
And
the
see,
marginalized in the text, and you
I love
elevate their voice.
yes, keep going, keep going. So we're preaching from the margins. Keep going, keep going. This is good.
Yeah. So that was also, was it De La Torre talking about reading the Bible from the margins. There's so many ways. It's basically liberation theology is looking at the text through the lens of those who majority folks who have written the books tell us this is the way to read this Bible. We look at it from a different perspective, and it gives us a freedom. And and it makes me think about, even to quote Bell Hooks, rest in peace,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
she says that those on the margins actually, not quote her, but paraphrase her, those on the margins have like almost an advantage at reading the text, because we see things from the margins that those who are not on the margins don't see. They don't have the lens to see it. So we're at an advantage in a way to read the text if we're free enough to look at it that way.
So you need both voices, right?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
it's kind of like more, we need more of the Bible from the margins. Let me pause to say that. But it's kind of like
Yeah.
what Lisa Thompson talks about when she says there are these Black women preachers whose voices are muted and often left out of biblical stories,
Mm-hmm.
biblical narratives, and in our preaching. And so she talks about when Black women preach from their marginality, or when they're not necessarily from their marginality, but when their perspective enters the moment, the preaching moment, that she talks about it lends fresh air or brings fresh air
Yeah.
of the beliefs and the ideals of the community. It brings fresh air to the community. So I
I
love
agree.
what you're sharing. I think you need the voices on the margins. We need more of
Yeah.
that in our scholarship. We need more of that in our preaching.
We're going to talk about something that you hear more and more about today. Seems like you hear about it more than we ever did before, and that's dementia.
It's not just an old folks disease. It's not just old folks need to worry about it. Anyone can get dementia. You can get it as, we have people that's in their 20s and 30s that have been diagnosed with it. And then also, if you don't have dementia, you may be a family caregiver or care partner, and you're still impacted, and you still need to know about the disease so you can be able to better support your family or friend that is living with dementia.
Part-time job, full-time hustle, all-time Shiro to all of us. You nurture, we listen. You teach, we thrive. You lift our spirits, but we've got to lay down the truth. It's time for you, our Shiro, to stretch for the stars. A free online chat can give you the personalized tips you need to start boosting your retirement savings today. Start saving more for retirement so you can feel prepared and live your life to the fullest. Visit aceyourretirement.org.
So what is some major hesitancies around this vaccine?
Because I ask younger people all the time, why haven't you gotten the shot? A lot of people say, well, my mom hasn't gotten it. And so I think people are impacted by the parents and whatever reasons they have for not getting it. I don't know if you heard Nicki Minaj put out information about her cousin having his testicles swollen, and of course that took off, went viral.
Can we clarify that? The vaccine did not cause his testicles to be enlarged?
None of that. I mean, we do have some risk associated with the vaccine, but the things that we hear out in the public aren't what they are. I want to shift briefly to a point in our show, or a point whenever I'm engaging audiences in this kind of setting and in this kind of platform, a point in our show where we want to share a word with those who may be watching and they're confused about a lot of what we're sharing. They're confused about, maybe there's a young pastor watching who's like 16 or 17 or 20 or even younger than that, who's saying, I don't even know what a homiletical method is. I don't even know what my theology of preaching is. What advice would you give to a preacher who's starting out, who may not be a scholar? Because we do understand that there are some great voices who preach, who do not have the same academic interest that you and I have, but they're great preachers, right? So my question would be, what would you say to that individual, or what advice would you give them?
First of all, I would say keep listening to a lot of sermons. Listen to different people and be free. Try to figure out your voice, because I'm not gonna say how old I am, but it's taken me a long time to figure out my voice. But I didn't give up. I was ready to give up at one time. So definitely do not give up, but listen to different voices. I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
Listen to different voices.
Yes. Keep going.
Listen to different voices so that you can realize that there's just not one way to preach. There is not one way to preach. And that's why I love Lisa Thompson. Her book just deals with how do we preach from the everydayness of our lives. There's God is in everything. So don't get hung up on, I'm trying to be like this great preacher like Pastor Jennifer Garner, who has been preaching and slaying pulpits all over the earth.
Or Pastor Moya Harris. Yes.
Be real.
Or Pastor Moya Harris. Yes. I've been saying that our authenticity is what God is interested in the most in our preaching. And that God, I said this a couple of weeks ago, God called you and your experience. He called you and the package that you're in. So this has been really, really fruitful. I can say for the first time since I've been on the Hope TV, time flew tonight. Like it flew by because I'm really passionate about what we're talking about. And I can tell that you're passionate about it as well. So there are a couple of terms. Yes, there are a couple of terms that we use that I want to make sure we clarify for our audience. And then I would like for you to tell us how we can follow you and how we can support you in your research and in your scholarship. So you and I have been talking about womanism. And so somebody in our audience may be saying, what is that? So could you give us a quick and dirty definition of womanism?
Ooh, put me on the spot. Basically, womanism is the intersection of it's a liberation theology, intersection of Black theology and feminist theology, where Black women were left out. It is a way that we look at the world and we fight for Black people, for all people, and we elevate Black women, whether it's theological, literary, but it's really about Black women being free to be Black women and fighting for the community.
I love it. And that's what we need to be about. That's what we need to be about, fighting for our communities. This is a season and a time at the beginning of the year where people are looking for hope. People are looking for purpose. People are looking for joy. And I think as preachers and as the church, that's what we need to be doing, spreading more hope, spreading more joy, and lifting Black women and lifting our people. Wonderful. Yeah. So you have the closing comments. Is there anything you want to leave with our Theology in 30 audience? Any books we need to read before you tell us how we can support you?
I would just, I can't even think of any books right now. I got so many in my mind. I would just say, read anything about Frank A. Thomas, like his method for young preachers. I like to never quit praising God freed me to be able to look at the text and look at the world and be able to look at the trouble, look at the hope, and just get a process. If you're stuck, it saved me. If you want to follow me, I'm on Instagram and on Twitter, and it's Redeemed70, but it's redeemed without the first E. It's RDEEMEDED70. If you want to follow me. And if you see anything that's dope about hip hop and preaching, send it my way. If you want to have a conversation about it, I would love to have a conversation about it.
Awesome. So the good news is that all the pressure isn't on you. All of your information is under your picture for our viewers today. And I just want to thank you again. Thank you so much for saying yes and for making time to have this conversation. I don't know how the Theology in 30 audience feels, but I think we should have you back. I think we need to have you come back at some point and just kind of keep us updated about your scholarship and your journey. Again, this is Theology in 30 on Hope TV. It's season 6. We are so glad to bring you new content, and we want to thank you for your viewership. That concludes our episode for this week, but you already know what I need. I need all of you to tune in next week, because if you enjoyed this conversation with Reverend Harris, you are definitely going to enjoy next week's conversation. I'm not going to tell you who it's going to be. You got to watch. Y'all have a wonderful weekend, and just know we are the House of Hope Atlanta. Our pastor is Dr. E. Dewey Smith Jr., and we believe that life with God is better in every way, every day. Have a great night, family.